You know, I think I've always thought that there's probably no city in the United States outside of the formerly Jim Crow South that was more affected by the 60s, by the political and social and ethnic and counterculture movements of the 60s in Berkeley, California. I mean, it almost seems to some degree that Berkeley kind of invents movement. For example, in 1964, the free speech movement on the Cal campus was the first of those great 60s campus rebellions and upheavals. It spread to colleges, universities all over the country and even to other parts of the world, and yet it kind of happened first here in Berkeley. And I think you could also make a case for saying that the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst in 1974 from her Berkeley apartment by the Symbionese Liberation Army, that kind of, if it didn't end the 60s, it symbolized the way in which the 60s were over, and a very different decade, the 70s, was how different that decade was. And as I'm sure some of you know, Patricia Hearst was kidnapped on February 4th, 1974, and today is the 50th anniversary, February 4th, 2024. We're literally at the 50th anniversary, so it's altogether fitting and proper that we should be discussing Roger's new book, Searching for Patty Hearst. Roger grew up in Michigan. He graduated from the University of Michigan, where he was a student activist and student journalist. He was the former editor of the student newspaper. And then he moved west and lived in Berkeley, I guess, for what, maybe 35 years?
Right, exactly.
35 years, and then moved back to Michigan not too long ago. During his Berkeley years, Roger at different times worked for the San Francisco Chronicle, the Oakland Tribune, San Jose Mercury News. He's also published articles in national journals, the New York Times, Atlantic, and media of that category. He has published several nonfiction books, which have gained awards on a whole, great variety of different subjects, both national and international. He's made movies, he's written plays, he even had a publishing house headquartered in Oakland at one time. And yet I think during all those years, I've just finished reading the book, but it seems to me during all those years, he continued to be kind of fascinated by and focused on what I guess was one of the first big stories we covered, the 1974 kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. Roger covered that and the kind of bizarre events that occurred in the years after that for the New Times magazine. And I think way back then he committed himself, promised himself he was going to write a book on it. And now 50 years later, he has fulfilled that promise. The book came out just a few weeks ago, just last month. And it is the first book of fiction that Roger has written. It's an historical novel. But it's an historical novel in which the main character is a journalist called Roger Rapoport. And I think all the characters in the book, and it has a lot of characters, I think they're all real people before their deaths. So I think one of the really fascinating things about the book is, and it's a fascinating book, it raises this question of what is the line between factual historical narrative and historical fiction. And it's one of the many kind of fascinating questions that the book raises. This afternoon, Roger's going to talk for 25 or 30 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for some questions and informal discussion. There will also be plenty of time for you to come up and buy a copy or several copies of the book. And then I believe it's still true that Roger's publisher is having a reception starting at 4 o'clock at the Acme Bar Company. Is that the case?
Bar and Grill.
Bar and Grill.
On St. Pat.
On St. Pat Avenue.
The address is here.
Okay. It's on St. Pat Avenue in I don't know what the address is, but it's sort of 1 block south of the university.
It's 2311.
2311, then it's two or three blocks out. But anyway, it's just a couple blocks south of the University Avenue. And there should be plenty of time for all of you to come. As I understand it, maybe some of the people who are in the book may be there, and there's going to be free food, and you're all invited. Finally, I should mention that I first met Roger more years ago than either of us would like to admit, when he took my California history class that was given by UC Extension at the California Historical Society. And I don't know if that class, I don't know what the big impact was on that class of Roger's life. I suppose it probably wasn't much. But it is kind of nice to know that at least one of my students made good. So it does give me a lot of pleasure to introduce a distinguished scholar of California history, Roger Rapoport.
So before I get started, I've got to do this. Hold on. This is so good. Okay. All right, we got it. Great. So first of all, thank you all for coming. I know that it was a little tricky today. Before I get started on my talk, I want to, the 2 or 3 people here who don't know every single fact in the Patty Hearst case, just a little refresher course. We're going to make this really easy. Here we go. So, as you all know, the SLA started small. There was a convict named Donald DeFreeze who escaped from Soledad, and Donald came back to, guess where? East Bay. Here he is. And he was known to a lot of people who lived in Berkeley because there was a Black Cultural Association of young people, some of them were students, other radicals, who were working in the prison movement and went to battle it over. So in prisons, and they met a number of people who were in prison. Freeze was one of them. So obviously when he got out of prison, he hooked back up. Here's, I'm sorry, let me go back. Nancy Lynn Perry. She was one of the Berkeley people that he reconnected with. And then he got involved with a number of other people, including Joseph Romero, Patricia Hearst.
Here.
Yeah, we don't have a mic. Patricia Sotize, some of these people worked at the Berkeley Library. They had different backgrounds. One had worked for Barry Goldwater, Sonoma, cheerleader. They worked from all over. There was Bill Harris, who we joined later. At this point, it's a very small group. And they decided, this gets a little complicated, that they were going to take out the much-loved superintendent of schools in Oakland, who was involved in a couple of ideas that they didn't like. One of them was a program that involved tracking potential violence in the Oakland schools. They were very upset about this federal funding. They were also worried about metal detectors and student IDs. They saw this kind of a tracking program. Going to school while black might be the way to characterize it. So they decided to take action, and they assassinated Marcus Foster, almost killed his assistant, Robert Black. Well, as you can imagine, this was a total mistake, a complete disaster. The left, Angela Davis, Jane Fonda, Empress Magazine, where I worked as a contributing writer, ran editorials. They were off to a terrible, terrible start. To make it even worse, their safe house in Concord, which was in the air. Unfortunately, 2 of the members of the who were suspects in the case, Joseph Romero and Russell Little, were arrested, and they were tracked down to the SLA safe house, which they tried to burn down because they had a lot of evidence in that safe house, including a hit list of their next potential victims, one of whom was Raymond Procunian, the head of the director of the Department of Corrections. So they weren't starting small. Well, things after that, they decided to go a different route. You have to remember, in 1974, there weren't as many billionaires as there were today. But one of the billionaires in the Bay Area was the Hearst family, particularly Patty Hearst's father, Randolph Hearst. they found her name as student director in Cal. So, and they decided to kidnap her just on the eve of her wedding to Stephen Lee, who was her fiance, who she'd met at Crystal Springs School for Girls 3 years earlier when she was a 16-year-old woman. And Steve was badly beaten, Patty was dating. For the first weeks, they were in Daly City, in a 1,200 square foot house, now 9, they were 8 before the kidnapping, now there were 9, 6 women, 3 men. And Patty was in a closet for part of that time. The SLA asked the Hearst to give away free food to everybody in California who needed it. And the trial program in Oakland went very, very badly. There were riots, people got hurt, there were arrests. It was not well. By this point, they were on the run. And on April Fool's Day, Patty, frustrated with her father for not answering her, because obviously we're talking petty cash here, $4 million, $6 million, whatever it was, compared to $1 billion company. But of course, this was all tied up in 2 things. A large corporation, which is where the money was. But more to the point, the FBI, the hostage consultants, Governor Ronald Reagan, the Attorney General all said the same thing to Randy Hearst. You ransom your daughter, and who's next? There's going to be more of this action. There are going to be bombings. Who knows, they might even come after citizens. So don't motivate these people. Patty, of course, took it very, very badly. She couldn't understand why they weren't just writing a check on the spot. Of course, her mother was completely flabbergasted. And when Patty announced she was going to stay and fight and join the SLA, Patty told the assembled media sitting literally on her doorstep in Hillsborough that she thought the tape was a fake, that Patty hadn't really converted, that actually she was dead. And at that moment, she and Randy went to the airport and flew to Mexico to spend some time cooling down with Desi Reyes and Mrs. Smith. And that further antagonized Patty. It got even worse when Catherine took another appointment to Governor Reagan's, the UC Board of Regents, another 16-year term for the Board of Regents, which she was equally upset about because Reagan, if you can believe this, during the free food thing, actually made a public statement saying he hoped that all the people who got the free food from the Hearst came down with a case of botulism. So that didn't help. Nobody else. Well, by this point, Patty decided, the SLA decided, it was time to prove that she hadn't been brainwashed. So they did what anybody would do in that situation. They robbed a bank, right? They needed the money. They already had the publicity. They were on the front page of the newspapers all over the country. This story, by the way, happened at the end of the Vietnam War. There was a war in the Middle East. There was an energy crisis. And there was something called Watergate. Everybody remembers that. Well, this story actually knocked Watergate off the front page. And it got even bigger when they robbed the bank. Not just any bank, but a bank owned by the father of a childhood friend, Trish Tobin. You see here, the original wanted poster. I got this at San Luis Obispo. This is a collectible. And that's the wanted poster that went out on post offices all over the country. I didn't have it when I started my tour, so I liked it. I had a barter for a book. Okay. Well, by now, Patty is really going after her family. She's going after her ex-fiance. Steve has been dumped. She's fallen in love with one of the kidnappers, Willie Wolf, who was a student here. She's announcing that they're hers. Steve is her fiance. The wedding is off. He's an agent's pig, obviously. And as you can see, there's Willie. And there's Steve. We'll hear more about Steve in a minute. It's one of the hideouts. SLA did a terrible job. I'm sorry, excuse me, the FBI did a terrible job. They flew in agents all over the country. They kept showing up 2 days too late every place they went. New York, Golden Gate, San Francisco. FBI was under a lot of heat because they hadn't found Jimmy Hoff, who disappeared a year earlier. And they were really under pressure to find this real man. And they did not do very well. This is a great story. So obviously they were hot. They had to get out of town. Very, very naively, they went to where Donald DeFreeze knew a lot of people in Los Angeles, where he'd been arrested multiple times for all kinds of felonies. and they decided to break out into 3 teams, 3 each, and Patty was picked by the Harrises to kidnap his wife. And they went shopping. And during the shopping trip, Bill Harris, the kidnapper, was arrested. I should say tackled for shoplifting. So Patty did what any kidnapped victim would do. She was hiding in the back of the van. She got up, she took out a machine gun, which she didn't know anything about. She didn't train an M1, which she had trained because she could take a target practice and fire off about 80 rounds. Bill and Emily got away, they ran away, and here we are. Now they've got a vehicle, they got rid of that. So they did what any smart victim would do. They kidnapped and carjacked a 17-year-old high school student named Tom Matthews. And Patty, because she had previously been kidnapped herself, according to Tom, was very good. He basically said after she talked about it, very friendly. She said she had a nightmare before she was kidnapped that possibly this was going to happen to her. She could really relate to him. She rubbed his back. He said he had a big state baseball tournament. They were going to let him go for the tournament. They didn't want to keep him too long. And when they released him and his vehicle after carjacking somebody else, she gave him a big kiss. Okay. Well, meanwhile, back at the safe house, things weren't going very well. The 3 members that I just described were waiting to reconnect. They knew something was wrong. But there was a problem. The van, the one you just saw, well, they left a parking ticket. Guess what? They had the address of the safe house. So the police went to the safe house. They were gone by then. But somebody next door told them where they moved to. And this turned out to be the biggest firefight on American soil. 9,000 Americans fired. And 6 of the SL members died, including Dr. Willie Wolf, her mother, and 4 women. Okay. Here's Willie Wolf's. So Patty did a eulogy for all these people, and that was kind of when things kind of went radio silent. Well, by this point, they needed to get out of Los Angeles. Well, that's not so easy. But fortunately, they had a friend, Jack Scott, who ran the Institute for Sports and Society up here, posed as her husband. And they drove east to Pennsylvania with his parents, posing as Patty's in-laws, so sleeping in motels and so on. They got to Pennsylvania, and that's when things really got tough. Everybody was battling. There was just a lot of disagreement. They decided to write a book to try to make some money. Instead of robbing banks, they decided to write a book. That didn't work out. The book deal fell through. And then finally, they went to New York, and then they were running out of money. Things were getting tough. Randy, by the way, by this point, had given up totally on any kind of negotiation with the SL. He decided it was worthless. And so they robbed not 1, but 2 banks in the Sacramento area. And one of the robbers, Carmichael, Emily Harris's gun discharged accidentally at a woman bringing in a church. Myrna Opshay died. It was an accidental shooting. By this point, they decided the only place that they could be safe. This now was Little and Romero, the guys that were arrested for killing Marcus Foster, were sentenced to life. And Patty was arrested on the same day as the Harrises for bank robbery and kidnapping. And she went to trial. And in probably one of the worst outcomes the family could imagine. Her case went first, and Kathleen Bailey, who was a celebrity attorney, did a disastrous defense. The brainwashing defense collapsed, and she was sentenced to 7 years. The Harrises were similarly convicted. And then Patty was commuted in 1979 by President Jimmy Carter after 22 months. And went on to marry her bodyguard. And as you can see in this AI photo, Bill Clinton, presumably after reading her book, a 400-page book about the case, explaining how she'd been tortured and so on, and everything that she did, she was completely a victim, and she didn't want to do any of these things, but they brainwashed her and so on. decided to pardon him in his last official act as president, 2 hours in 2001, before he left the White House. And on the same pardon announcement, he pardoned his book. Okay, so where's Patty today? She's in New York. She goes to pool kennel shows, reads a lot of them. She's active with John Waters in a number of films. She has a daughter who's also an actress, who played Abigail Folger in a movie recently, one of the victims of the Manson murders. She's a grandmother. She's a philanthropist. And she also has a guided tour of Sing Sing that you can take. If you go there to a gift shop, you get a guided DVD tour of Sing Sing. So that's kind of a quick outline of the story. But what I want to tell you is about me. So many of you, of course, remember my wife, Margot Lynn. And we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Margot. We talked a little bit about Berkeley. Well, it turns out that Steve Reed taught with a woman who was Margot's roommate at Mills College. And they were friends, they stayed friends. And she realized somehow they connected. And she mentioned that Steve and Patty were close friends. She had been a teacher with Steve and knew Patty well. And through that connection, I got a chance to meet Steve and get an article a few times about it, which led to a book. And Steve moved into my house during the search for Patty. And during that time, we wrote a 275-page manuscript until he came in one day and said, "We got to stop." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, you're on chapter 9, and I'm only on chapter 3. I said, "What? You're rewriting my book?" He said, "Yeah, I'm firing you. And I'm going to take your manuscript, and I'm going to publish it, and obviously minus a lot of the details, like Patty going on a roots trip to Atlanta with her mother, and her mother using the N-word right and left all over Atlanta, or Patty getting the compliments of Steve a geometry final exam in a class she was failing and not doing well in. And the teacher used the same final exam. So in the book, we wrote about how that final was given to Patty so she could pass. And the point was that Steve didn't want a lot of these details in the book. So he paid me off. A friend of mine, David Pessin, worked out a very good arrangement. I got paid. Steve got his book, which came out 3 days before she went to trial. In addition to that, I interviewed Bill Harris, a kidnapper, at great length for the Oakland Tribune after he was paroled. I interviewed Tom Noguchi, the coroner, who autopsied. You remember during that firefight, they burned the SLA members alive. Nobody knew Patty was in that safe house. Well, the guy who had to figure that out while the families were sitting there waiting for that word was Thomas Noguchi. You may have heard of him. Marilyn Monroe, Janis Joplin, Bobby Kennedy were all autopsied by Thomas Noguchi. I did a long interview. And on top of this, one of the trial judges in the Tom Matthews kidnapping case was my grandmother's brother. So I have a lot of connections to this. And I'd like to say that my book is the final word on the story. As some of you may have noticed today, if you read the Washington Post, I interviewed Bill Harris very recently. And today I have an interview, a part of the story that I did for the Post. It's out today, has Bill Harris interview. And Bill has been helping me kind of keep up to date on a lot of details. So I want to give you just one example of why I didn't know. You can understand that two people in the same room or in the same safe house may have completely different versions of what happened. Stress affects memory. So Jack Scott, who you just heard about, well, he sued Patty when she published her book because his version of what happened when they were on the run, posing as husband and wife, is a lot different than Patty's version. So you can understand the problem is that unless you talk to everybody, you don't really get all different sides of the story, which is what the book does. And that's my effort to do this. So in effect, a lot of details are hard to sort through because everybody has a completely different version of what happened. For example, you remember that there was a guy named Robert Mueller III who got some attention during the impeachment hearings for Trump. He was a former FBI agent. He was also the U.S. attorney at the time that the family was applying for the pardon with Carter. And he finally proposed, and he wrote a scathing letter. Carter. I'm sorry. attacking Patty's defense that she should be pardoned, saying, no way. She just wants to get off and she's a person, period. So there's a lot of debate about this, all these details. But to make it even more personal, I had a long discussion yesterday with a reporter closing a piece for a San Francisco newspaper, trying to figure out which SLA members are still around, including some in Berkeley. And one of the things that has been repeated by me and others is that one of those two guys who killed the Oakland school superintendent, Joe Romero, according to the newspapers, if you go on the website right now, go on the internet, go on Wikipedia, go anywhere you want, and you'll see that Joseph Romero has been turned down 11 times for commutation, for parole. I'm sorry. And he's still in jail in Crescent City. Well, guess what? I found out yesterday that's not true. Well, it turns out the Department of Corrections doesn't send out press releases, and people who get paroled don't send out press releases updating. So that's just a small example of how this story has become so complicated. And everywhere I go, everybody I talk to has a different version of that. So in my book, everybody gets equal time. Every party to the story has an opportunity to tell what they think happened, how it happened, was she brainwashed, was she not brainwashed, and so on. And we're very fortunate today. We have actually an adolescent psychiatrist in the room who's going to answer the question that hasn't even been asked. The question is brainwashing versus the Stockholm Syndrome. Now, everybody's heard about the Stockholm Syndrome. It was attached to Patty after all this happened. Actually, the Stockholm Syndrome was invented after she was kidnapped and after her background. The first actual article by a psychiatrist at Michigan State was written while Patty was in jail, being sought, I should say. So everybody says, well, was she brainwashed? Was she a victim of Stockholm Syndrome? Unfortunately, my friend Hank Massey was here today, and he actually knew one of the psychiatrists, right? Margaret Singer, who analyzed Patty for the court. Right? So would you like to tell us the difference between... Come on up.
You need your big voice, ain't
The big voice. Okay. First of all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Okay. I'm going to digress just for fun a little bit. So the question is often asked, where were you when Kennedy was shot? And all of us know where we were when Kennedy was shot. And the question sometimes comes up, where were you when Patty Hearst was kidnapped? And since we're in the Historical Society, I was living on Berkeley Street at that time, just around the corner. And I was living with my first wife, who I met during the People's Park riots. Now, we weren't rioting, we were volunteering at the Free Church on Fulton Street. I was volunteering as a doctor because I just recently finished medical school. My first wife was in the English department at Cal, a student, and she was volunteering to take the stories of the people who came in having been injured, mostly running from the police, and their injuries were knee scrapes. So somewhat later, so when Patty was kidnapped, I was still in graduate school, finishing my psychiatry training in '74, and I was probably sitting with a patient, and I didn't know she had been kidnapped until I turned on the radio to drive back with the Bay Bridge back to Berkeley. And that kind of puts it in context, but the question is, what was going on inside of her head? And I made a few notes. Let's see.
Yes, sir. Make sure because we have
Okay, a few notes. What is Stockholm Syndrome? Stockholm Syndrome is a combination of several phenomena. It's impossible to distinguish, but it's identification with your kidnappers, it's brainwashing, it's indoctrination, it's coercion and fear. She may have been raped. It's a dissociated state of mind. It's an altered state of mind in which you're partly with yourself and partly observing yourself from outside. And the dissociation kind of protects you against reality. It can protect you somewhat against fear and physical pain. And that's basically it. A little bit later, 2 or 3 years later, I had some contact with Margaret Singer, who is the psychologist the defense called to do a psychological testing for Patty as part of her defense. And I don't think these tests have ever been released. But I did talk with Margaret, and Margaret said that Patty was basically a normal, not very complex person. So, in the interest of time, let's go. Thank you. So, one of the things that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about tonight is her father, who doesn't get the airtime that he really deserves. He did a lot of back-channel negotiation with people who knew the SLA members, people who were in prison, who had recently gotten out of prison. And he tried very hard, even tried to get Ramiro Little to go on national television. The judge shot it down, to make an appeal for the SLA to release her. That didn't get much attention, because he didn't want anybody to know that. But his hands were tied, even though he had the money. He would have basically had to take out a loan, because the Hearst Corporation itself was not going to acquiesce out of concern for what the authorities felt would be a high-risk situation. Because guess what? If they ransom Patty, who knows who's next? I mentioned San Simeon. Well, actually, during the trial, San Simeon was fined $1 million worth of damage. You can go on the tour. You can actually visit the cottage. Not the SLA, but the New World Liberation Fund. So there was some real concern about motivating these people. Another thing that I want to talk about is her marriage. She got married to her, and basically, keep this in mind. So she was living at home. She fell in love with Steve at 16. They were going to get married. Then she fell in love with Willie Wolf. Then after he died, another SLA member, Steve Celaya, became her romantic partner, and that's who she was with at the time she was kidnapped. And then she fell in love with Bernard Shaw, her bodyguard. So there was a lot of transitions going on. But there's an interesting fact. She's a dog lover, as you know, and she and Bernard Shaw had guard dogs. But you know, with a guard dog, you have to be really careful about that attack command. It has to be a word you never use, except in a crisis. So they picked a word you've never heard before, ORRICK, O-R-R-I-C-K, which happened to be the name of the judge who sentenced him. That is a true story. Finally, I just want, before we stop, this is the golden anniversary of this case that's never going to die. And I think part of why we're here and why we're having this conversation is this isn't just Berkeley history, it's not even California history. There has never been a kidnapped victim who then went out and robbed a bank in this manner. It's totally a unique story. The fact that it happened in Berkeley is not surprising, but it is an interesting fact that nowhere has this ever happened. And the SLA members, I've had a long talk with Bill Harris since the book came out. He called me to give me a hard time. He said, Roger, this cover, you make it look drop dead gorgeous with AI. He said, I'm really hurt. He said, I'm the one that needs the makeover. But what Bill said was, they knew that Patty Hearst, was a young woman about to get married, and that's about all they knew. They did not do their homework. And the communiques that to this day talk about all sorts of issues like Black Lives Matter, automation, the Vietnam War. One of the things they talked about was people getting the economic situation where people couldn't afford to buy rent apartments and buy houses. A lot of the issues she talked about beautifully were from an insider's perspective because she was part of a very wealthy family. So she had a different take on it. But she said they never imagined that when they said to her, they gave her a gun, and they said, you can walk right now. They never imagined she would stay. But as she said, where was I going to go? She wasn't going to go home to her parents. Obviously, she and her mother. Her mother wanted to go to Stanford. She didn't want her to marry Steve. They fought about everything. And she wasn't going to go home. Steve Weed, who I lived with for 4 months, we room and board and so on, write this book. Then he wanted to redact it. She didn't want to go back to him. And she made it very clear to us that the wedding was off. She said at the time, I think I got the quote, Strangely enough, as I was being bound by Bill Harris, I felt a sense of relief. And she told Tam Matthews the same thing, that she'd been dreaming, how is she going to get out of this thing? So it wasn't like she could just walk out of an SLA safe house, go to the nearest police station, and then turn herself in and then go there. Right? That was part of the dilemma that she faced. But what really astonished them was once she joined and decided to stay and fight, Bill Harris said something interesting. You remember that shootout in Church, where she literally saved his life. He said, there's nobody in the SLA that I would have rather had firing that M1 than Patty Hearst. She was a good shot, and she had been taught how to shoot by her father when she was 9 years old. So it wasn't just her politics, which was her conversion. It was the fact that she, basically was articulate. She was from Berkeley, so she understood a lot of these issues. She had been apolitical. She'd walked through United Farm Worker picket lines. Ironically, Cesar Chavez signed that commutation petition for the Committee to Free Patty Hearst. No hard feelings. So you get the picture. And they couldn't believe it. They thought, they just thought she was going to go. Once the heat was on, they figured it's crazy. We're not going to get the money. She's a liability. We're all going to get killed. Let's get rid of her. No way. And one of the key points was one vote per member. So there were 9 people, 6 women, 3 men, and the women outvoted the men all the time in their various deliberations. But the feminist perspective, particularly as it related to Steve, when she started talking about the problems with Steve, they explained to her what her life was going to be like. Do you really want a station wagon, a dog, and 3 kids? Is that really what you want? Remember, Steve was a Hearst in waiting. You don't know what that means. He was literally obsessed. I know this because he brought Hearst drugs to my house for safekeeping. Obsessed with Hearst art, Hearst paintings, and so on. And Patty paid the rent. She bought the groceries. She did the cooking. She cleaned up, and then his friends came over for dinner. So this was not the kind of life she imagined. And in a very telling moment, Steve told me this. She said, "God, I wish I'd met you 10 years later." He said, "Why?" "Well, because you've had all these experiences. You've had all these women. You've had all, you've had all these affairs, and I'm never going to have any of that. I'm stuck. I'm stuck with you, basically." So she had all kinds of reasons to not want to go home. At the same time, she was deathly afraid of turning herself in because of what happened in Los Angeles. So that made her even harder. But remember this: when she was arrested, she was not living with the SLA. In fact, for months she was living on her own. So that's a kind of a twist. Kidnapping twist you don't hear very often, where they weren't keeping her captive. So Chuck, let's open up to questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just if everybody could keep their questions fairly short and concise for comments, so that we get as much time as possible for Roger answering, for other people to participate. So go ahead. Yes.
I'm very curious. Marcus Foster, you may have spoken about this more in the beginning, but what was their motivation for killing him?
Well, the reason that they picked Marcus Foster was there was one reason. It was Donald DeFries himself, who was convinced that this was a pilot project to track black youth. And they were starting with ID cards, metal detectors, and then they were going to do psychological profiling with a professor from UCLA with money from the Department of Justice to figure out which kids were most likely to get into trouble and become candidates for police for arrest. So it was a profiling. So on his own, with several of the SLA members, they did this when they were just a tiny group. It was really one man's, you could call it paranoia, but it was his opinion. And he had just escaped from prison. And as a young black man, he had had a lot of issues in school himself. So they picked a very much admired, loved superintendent, worked with the left a lot. And people were just horrified. They couldn't have picked a worse candidate. It was a disaster.
And just Marcus Foster was the first black superintendent of the Oakland Public Schools and one of the few black superintendents of any public schools in the country at that time. So he was a real pioneer.
Yeah, he was a great superintendent. And he worked across lines with the, you know, all parts of the community.
More questions?
How can the reader tell which parts of the book really happened and which parts you made up?
Well, I can answer that question. The answer is that there are some things in the book that are verbatim. And I'll give you one example. My interview with Bill Harris appeared in the Oakland Tribune, and that is verbatim. Okay? The communiques, you can look them up. A lot of that language was verbatim. And of course, all the major events that we've described really happened. But at the same time, you have to remember, and there were a lot of people, nobody was taking notes, there was no tape recordings, there was no cameras, so nobody knows what happens. And this is, I wish I'd written this, but I'm going to read it. Michael Frayn wrote a book about the scuttling of the German attempt to build an atom bomb by nuclear scientists in a play called Copenhagen. It said, the great challenge facing the storyteller and the historian alike is to get inside people's heads, to stand where they stood and see the world as they saw it, to make some informed estimate of their motives and intentions. And this is where recorded and recordable history cannot reach. Even when all the external evidence has been mastered, the only way into the protagonist's head is through the imagination. So the answer is, most of the dialogue in the book, almost all of it, is my dialogue. And that's because there's so many situations where nobody was there to record it.
There are some real surprises towards the end of the book, and I won't give them away, but I recommend reading the book.
I want to add this note that younger people who are dwarfed with, inundated with information from a single source, the point of the book is to do what journalists do, which is to talk to all sides and then fairly represent all points of view. And if that message gets across to younger people who don't know who Patty Hearst is, I'm very happy, because you can't just take one person's word for anything. Stress affects memory, for sure. You know that to be true. And even if somebody was in the room, their version of it can be colored, their memory can be clouded. And that's why the book tries to give everybody equal time, all different participants.
More questions?
More statement. I'm really glad you included on one of the websites announcing your appearance in various places the recording of her delivering her speech. She sounds so calm.
Mm-hmm.
It's astonishing.
Yeah. Well, that was part of her background too. She never had the word.
Yeah.
She didn't come from Vietnam, where Bill Harris had come from, with PTSD from fighting in Vietnam. So she had a little different story. She actually had a job in Capitals for 3 months, but other than that, she never really worked. So that was another minor wrinkle in her background that I think impacted her attitude. She was going to get the equivalent of $500,000 from the trust fund when she turned 21. So she wasn't panicking, at least until she was kidnapped.
Other questions? I have one. You titled the book "Searching for Patty Hearst." Did you find her? Do you feel like you understood her, understood what happened?
Is there anybody in this room who can answer that question? Yes, I'd like to meet you. I think part of the reason we're here is the enigma, the confusion, and some of it is her fault because she did something really important after she got caught. She became a totally different person. And the attempts of her attorney, and I want to tell this story because I love it. Her attorney, the first thing he did was sign a fee arrangement with her family. And in the fee arrangement, Patty had to sign this part of it. He said, I'm going to publish the first book on this. You, Patty, will not publish your book for 18 months after my book comes out, because I want to get the paperback out and make as much money as I can from the paperback before you do a book. That's a little bit of a conflict of interest. and he did a terrible job. So selling that thing got off to a very bad start, and that damaged her a lot. She wrote a whole book explaining that Bailey may have been drunk. Here we go again. Well, I really was brainwashed, but my lawyer was stupid. Okay, but that does cloud the story a little bit, right? She had to take that attorney. He was a very, very controversial defense attorney. He defended O.J., the Boston Strangler, so he had a lot of big cases, but nothing close to this.
You mentioned that the left really denounced the SLA when they took one.
Yes.
I'm wondering if there was any reaction from them after Patty was apprehended, after she got told she was brainwashed. Were they involved at that point, or was they just kind of check out because not for that?
That's a really good question. At the point that she was arrested, and when she recanted, she took a lot of heat, not just from the left, but from the right, from everybody. I mean, just to give you an example, I did a talk in Pasadena. A woman her age was about to have her debutante coming out party. It was canceled in Pasadena. They canceled proms and debutante parties coming up. It's all over the state. So a lot of people were mad at her for all kinds of different reasons, including the left, because they felt she'd done these very articulate communiques, and then to renounce everything, they were very disappointed. But to this day, I think a lot of what she said on women's issues really resonates. If you read all the things about Steve, all the sexist issues that she talked about, I mean, with Roe v. Wade and all that sort of thing, Dobbs' decision and all that, and obviously the economic situation. Obviously, there are many more billionaires today, and the economic situation in Berkeley is a lot different than when she was kidnapped. So she was predicting a lot of this stuff happening. She even talked about automation, forcing people to lose their jobs because robots were going to replace them. This was, 50 years ago, if you can believe it. And look what's happening in tech. They're making all this money, and what are they doing? Apparently, they're laying people off in some of these tech companies in large numbers, right? I have a niece who works at Google. She was very hurt. She called all of us up. She said, well, they just laid off thousands of people, and nobody even called me to find out whether I got killed. But she was predicting a lot of things from an insider's perspective. So when she recanted and decided she didn't want to go to jail, a lot of people were hurt. Go ahead.
You mentioned that the SLA members voted and that there were 6 women and 3 men.
That's right.
How many of those women were you able, I mean, a number of them died, how many of them were you able to interview?
None.
And none.
None.
So
only one is one.
Do you have any understanding of what these women, was it like seeing you as like a cult figure? Or
that's a really, really, really good question. Sing-Q was very effective in recruiting them. They were mostly from the Black Cultural Association. They had varying backgrounds. One was a librarian.
Mostly they were from what, you said?
Various backgrounds, widely different backgrounds.
But mostly white.
They were all white. He was the only black member of the SLA. I think the prison work in the Black Cultural Association, where they saw the conditions of the prison, which weren't very good, that was part of the conversion process. They felt that the prison system was very corrupt. And so I think that was the opener. And then when it came to Patty, I think they realized that was a publicity stunt. They were trying to get publicity, and that was their primary goal. But I don't think any of them thought Patty was going to stay. They thought they would get the $4 million, they would show the world how to do it, and other revolutionary groups would take similar action. But the FBI, of course, taught Randy out of doing that. So, but they were a very, very strong force. But Emily is the only one who's still of that group is alive.
And you did interview her?
No.
No. It's in the book.
In the book.
Right.
Most likely a Charlie Manson-like figure.
Right.
And people following him were experiencing very similar phenomena to the Charlie Manson
Yes.
followers. Charlie Manson
Patty Hearst made
It
it.
was political Berkeley also.
Yeah, Patty Hearst made it as an actress with the Pope of Trash, John Waters. He's done a bunch of things. So she became an actress, Hollywood actress. So it happened. But you're right, he did have that delusion. Go ahead. Okay. Well, we haven't talked at all about our grandfather, William Randolph Hearst, and I just want to add, you know, he built that fortune partly on this kind of narrative. The damsel in distress narrative. That was a big deal for him. And that's how he sold newspapers. Even, at one point, he even rescued a woman who'd been arrested in Cuba and brought her home through a reporter, and they wrote a story about it. So that was one of the ways that he got people to buy his newspaper, damsel in distress stories. So they flipped the script on the Hearst family. Chuck, do you have a question?
So when you say she was advanced in terms of her telling women's thinking, was that her, or was this the ideas that they gave her?
Both. She was living in a situation, because I live with Steve, and I heard his side of the story. And then I read and heard her side of the story. Okay? So I know both sides. Steve, everything was perfect. It was all set. Yes, I screwed it up. But they would have lived happily ever after. She couldn't wait to not go back. And when she was finally arrested, she had a love token from Willie Wolfe that she carried in her purse, which really hurt her defense. Because, okay, you're claiming this guy abused you in your trial, but why are you carrying a Olmec stone carving that he gave you and he had an action point he was wearing? So she obviously didn't want to go back to Steve Weed. She wanted a man who was more, treated her more as an equal, I guess you could say.
So had she confided in a friend?
All of them.
Before that?
Yes, Bill Harris, everybody.
No, before the kidnapping.
Yes, yes. She talked to her friends about it. Yeah, she was open to talking to her friends about it. She was worried.
She didn't want to get married.
She didn't want to go through, but she didn't know what to do. And, you know, she told her parents, you know, well, she wasn't going to go home. You know, and so that it was a very complicated situation.
So, what does she think of you both now?
I haven't reached for you yet.
Well, and
I'm trying.
what's your relationship with Steve Weed at this point?
Well,
And what about those things that are supposedly written by him, comments on your chapters?
that's fiction. I let Steve off very easy in my book. I'm going to do a spoiler. One of the reasons I did that was I wanted to try to tell the story from the point of view of all the key players, why they did what they did. The only person that I've really gotten close to in this attempt, because so many people have died, right, is Bill Harris. And I know his side of the story pretty well. Steve took a lot of heat from the family. Randy Hearst at one point said, you know, Steve moved in with the family after he got out of Walter Bates and was beaten up. He went and moved in with the Hearst. And the FBI was living there and Steve Weed was living there. Can you imagine? In the same house. And Steve, basically, Randy at one point said, the problem with Steve Weed is that he's not housebroken. So they really, and then Steve kind of attacked the family, so in a lot of interviews, and kind of made fun of him. Randy was a very smart guy. He was a hell of a pilot. He could have been, you know. He was a very smart guy. Thought he was a Hearst, so he had to, you know, become that. By the way, the Hearst Company, I know many of you read Hearst publications. I do not read for anything. I love the Chronicle. I read it a lot. I think the Hearst organization really was impacted dramatically by this, from being a very conservative organization. I think it's a much, Will Hearst publishes a fantastic magazine called Alta. If you haven't seen it, it's great. So Kevin Fagan is a close friend of mine, probably one of the best investigative reporters in the country. He writes for them. He wrote about the case today in the Chronicle. So I like, you know, I write for the Chronicle sometimes. I was subscribed. So I think it did have a big impact on the organization, to the good. The tragedy, to the good. Anybody else? What about you? Do you have any questions?
Well, you know, I just was thinking that one of your chapters is on Bill Hearst.
Right.
And
who I worked for.
Yeah.
Outside.
Yeah, and in that chapter, and again, I don't know whether this is historical fact or this is part or not, he himself talks about the history of his grandfather.
Right.
Very, very, very unfavorable.
Right.
Is that kind of a reflection of the numbers?
Well, his grandfather, I mean, we all know from Citizen Kane a little bit about his grandfather. He was a right-wing publisher who had a huge media empire well before the Murdochs, and they had a great impact politically on the country. And I don't think there's any question that he was to the left, of the corporation by far. But when I wrote for the Examiner, I had a chance to write for the Examiner. Things were changing again, in the years after Patty was. Will was part of that change. He was one of the young editors who made that happen. So that's he's considered to be a progressive force within that organization.
This is a little bit off center, but Stephen Weed's sleeping with her when she's a 16-year-old student of his.
Right.
And Margot knew about it.
Absolutely.
At the time.
No.
Wait.
No, not at that. No, but later she thought.
Well, I mean, you're not in a position to answer this question, but I have a 15-year-old granddaughter.
Right.
And the kids know everything. Now, I know this is a private school.
Right.
But it must have been known throughout the school.
Well, the one person...
Especially if he's giving her an exam to cheat with.
Yeah. So the answer is, Margot's friend, my wife's friend, the other teacher, she knew about it because she showed up one day, in the evening, and there was Patty sitting on the couch, and she started talking to Steve, and then Steve explained it to her, and then after they graduated, she got out. They became close friends in Berkeley, Steve and Patty. But other people did know about it. She had girlfriends in there. It wasn't a total secret.
But it never went up to the principal or anything?
No. She was just going over the time. They were very clear.
They weren't protecting the Hearst's name.
No, not at all. I don't think they used it. Okay. Well, great. So all of you know that there's a gathering at 4 o'clock. Is it 4:30 or whatever it is? After this. James, it's 4 or 4:30?
Yeah, 4.
4 o'clock, yeah. We moved to 4:30. And it's the Acme Bar and Grill. 20, I think actually Acme Bar. It's on San Pablo near University. I think it's 2311. Is that?
It's right near the post office.
Near the post office.
21:15.
I'm sorry, I'm wrong. 21:15. You're all welcome to join us. James, the publisher, is here. James, the publisher, is here from Chicago, so he's our host.
James, you want to come up and introduce the...
Oh,
Yeah.
hi. Please, you gotta join us. For more, please buy the book.
We need to clear out of here because it's a winter shelter and people are going to be coming in to set up for that. So we'll reopen the museum room for book signing.
We're going to go next door. Finally, I want to add one thing. I know the weather had an impact today. I am at Books Inc. on Tuesday at 7 o'clock. And I also have other events in San Francisco, Berlin, and Mountain View. And if you have friends that couldn't come because of the weather, pattyhearst.com has all the event dates, including the one at Books Inc. So your friends, because of the weather, they couldn't make it. If you would let them know. And finally, I want to add this 2 notes. One, Berkeley Historical Society, we very much appreciate you giving us this opportunity. And finally, I want to say something about my publisher. When you go to Books Inc. or any bookstore, you're going to see a large fiction section. I hate to say this, but there are literally in the stores hundreds and hundreds of independent publishers everywhere you go doing nonfiction. However, in fiction, most novels that you pick up come from billion-dollar corporations. So I want to thank my publisher for taking a risk, because for a small publisher to do a novel by somebody who isn't known is an enormous risk. Right? We don't even want to talk about that. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.